The body arrived in pieces, not from violence, from decay, 14 days in a sealed lead coffin under the Syrian sun. When the Senate opened the container in Rome, what emerged was no longer recognizable as human. The purple robes had fused to liquefying flesh. The laurel crown had sunk into the skull where the scalp had collapsed. The smell drove 6 senators from the chamber. 3 vomited onto the marble floor. This was an emperor. His name was Elagabalus. He died at 18. His grandmother ordered the assassination. The Praetorian Guard dragged him from a latrine where he'd tried to hide, killed him, mutilated the corpse, and threw it in the Tiber. The Senate ordered his name chiseled from every monument, his face scraped from every coin, his laws nullified, his appointments reversed. Within a month it was illegal to speak his name aloud in public spaces. But the smell remained in the Senate chamber for weeks. They burned incense, spread rose petals, opened the roof vents. Nothing worked. The stone had absorbed it. This is a story about 5 men who held absolute power over an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, an empire of 60 million people, the largest political structure the ancient world had known. We remember them not for their victories or their monuments, but for what they did with human bodies, when no law could stop them. We begin with systems, with structures, with the architecture of power that made cruelty not an aberration, but a function. The Roman Empire did not produce cruel emperors by accident. It produced them by design. The Principate, established by Augustus in 27 BCE, was a careful fiction. Rome was still theoretically a republic. The emperor was merely the first citizen. The Princeps, he held no official position called emperor. Instead, he accumulated republican offices, tribune, consul, pontifex maximus, and combined them into something that had never existed before: absolute power disguised as civic service. This disguise required constant maintenance. The Senate had to be consulted. They had to vote. Their votes had to appear voluntary. The emperor could not simply decree, he had to propose. He had to allow debate. He had to accept amendments, at least symbolically. The entire structure depended on everyone pretending the emperor was not an emperor. But behind the pretense stood the Praetorian Guard, 9 cohorts, 4,500 men, stationed in Rome itself, in violation of every republican tradition that forbade armed soldiers within the sacred boundary. They were the emperor's personal army. They ate better than the legions. They were paid better. They served shorter terms, and they could make or unmake emperors. In the 300 years of the Principate, the Praetorian Guard assassinated 13 emperors. They auctioned the throne to the highest bidder twice. They murdered entire families. They dragged corpses through streets, and they were legal. They were official. They were a permanent institution of the Roman state. This is important. The capacity for imperial cruelty was not personal, it was structural. Every emperor inherited the same tools, the same laws, the same precedents. The question was not whether they could act without restraint. The question was whether they would choose to. The Senate provided no meaningful check. By the 2nd century, most senators owed their positions to imperial patronage. Their wealth came from imperial favor. Their lives depended on imperial whim. They could vote, they could debate, they could send delegations, but they could not refuse. Pliny the Younger wrote that under Domitian, every meeting of the Senate felt like attending your own funeral. You spoke the required words, you cast the required vote, you watched colleagues disappear, and you came back the next day. The legal system offered no protection. The emperor was above the law, not by written statute, but by practical reality. He appointed all judges. He could overturn any verdict. He could pardon any crime. More importantly, he could define what constituted a crime. Maiestas treason became whatever the emperor said it was: a joke at dinner, a sigh during a speech, failing to laugh at the right moment. The jurist Ulpian wrote that what pleases the emperor has the force of law. This was not metaphor, this was legal doctrine. Even the gods provided no sanctuary. The emperor was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman religion. He interpreted divine will. He declared which gods were pleased and which were angry. He decided what the omens meant. After death, emperors were often deified. Their statues stood in temples. Priests made sacrifices to them. Refusing to worship a dead emperor could be prosecuted as atheism. All of this preceded the emperors we are about to examine. The structure existed. The precedents existed. The tools existed. What varied was the willingness to use them without any internal restraint whatsoever. The first of our 5 emperors did not appear cruel when he took power. He appeared dutiful, competent, even boring. His name was Tiberius. He was 55 years old when Augustus died in 14 CE, and the Senate confirmed him as princeps. He had military experience on the Rhine and in Pannonia. He had administrative experience in Rome. He had been married to Augustus's daughter Julia, though he despised her. He had been forced to divorce his first wife, whom he loved, to make that political marriage. He had lived his entire adult life doing what Augustus commanded, and he hated it. The ancient sources disagree about many things, but they agree on this: Tiberius did not want to be emperor. Suetonius records that he initially refused the position. The Senate had to beg him repeatedly. Some historians think this was false modesty, political theater. Others think it was genuine reluctance. We cannot know, but we know what happened after he accepted. For the first 8 years, Tiberius governed well. He reduced taxes. He improved the grain supply. He refused divine honors. He consulted the Senate genuinely, not theatrically. He even left Rome for months at a time, trusting administrators to handle daily affairs. Tacitus, who despised Tiberius, admits the early years were competent. Then something shifted. In 23 CE, Drusus died. Drusus was Tiberius's son, his only biological child. The death was officially attributed to illness, but rumors immediately spread that he had been poisoned. The prime suspect was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus had been Tiberius's closest advisor for years. Some sources suggest he was also Drusus's wife Livilla's lover. The poisoning was never proven, but Tacitus records that after Drusus's death, Sejanus's power became absolute. What happened next is documented in trial records, senatorial minutes, and multiple historical accounts. We can verify the basic facts, even as the motivations remain obscure. Tiberius began to withdraw from Rome, first for weeks, then for months. In 26 CE, he left for Campania and never returned. He settled on the island of Capri, in a villa complex built into the cliffs. He was 67 years old. He would live another 11 years, and he would never again set foot in the capital of the empire he ruled. This is the moment that makes everything else possible. The emperor, the living embodiment of Roman power, absents himself from the machinery of government. He leaves that machinery in the hands of Sejanus, who controls the Praetorian Guard, and now, effectively, controls access to the emperor himself. Letters to Tiberius go through Sejanus. Reports from Tiberius come through Sejanus. The Senate sees only what Sejanus allows them to see, and Sejanus begins the purges. The official charge is always maiestas, treason, conspiracy against the emperor. The evidence is always words, a comment at dinner, a letter to a friend, a poem that could be interpreted as critical. The trials are public. The Senate votes. Everything is legal. Everything follows procedure, and the convictions are unanimous. The punishment for maiestas was death, but before death came confiscation. The condemned person's property reverted to the imperial treasury. This is important. Every conviction enriched the emperor's personal fortune. Every purge generated revenue. The system incentivized accusation. Tacitus records that informers, delatores, became a recognized profession. They received a percentage of the confiscated property if their accusation led to conviction. Some became wealthy. Some were themselves eventually accused and convicted, their wealth in turn confiscated. The cycle fed itself. Between 23 and 31 CE, Sejanus orchestrated the prosecution of dozens of aristocrats. The exact number is disputed. Tacitus lists 43 by name, Dio Cassius suggests over 60. Some historians think these numbers are exaggerated, but the pattern is undisputed. Members of the imperial family were targeted first, then their associates, then anyone who might have sympathized with them, then anyone who failed to condemn them loudly enough. The trials were not secret, they were public rituals. The Senate met, the charges were read, witnesses testified. The accused could defend themselves, though few bothered. The verdict was pronounced, and then the condemned were taken to the Tullianum, the ancient prison carved into the rock of the Capitoline Hill, and strangled. Their bodies were thrown down the Gemonian stairs, where they were left to rot for days before being dragged to the Tiber by hooks. This was not hidden, this was visible. Seneca the Elder, who lived through this period, describes crowds gathering to watch the bodies. Children played near them, vendors sold food, it was public space. But in 31 CC, something unexpected happened. Tiberius turned on Sejanus. The details remain unclear. Some sources say Tiberius discovered that Sejanus planned to seize power directly. Others say that Antonia, Tiberius's sister-in-law, sent secret letters warning him. Still others suggest Tiberius had known all along, and simply decided Sejanus had become too powerful. The arrest was carefully staged. Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate to be read aloud during a regular session. The letter was long, meandering, filled with digressions. Sejanus sat in the chamber expecting honors. The Senate listened, and then the letter turned. It accused Sejanus of treason. It ordered his immediate arrest. Sejanus was seized in the Senate chamber. He was imprisoned. That same day he was strangled. His body was thrown on the Gemonian stairs. The crowd that had feared him for 8 years descended on the corpse. They beat it. They tore it apart. For 3 days pieces of Sejanus lay on the stairs. Then the remains were thrown into the Tiber. His wife Apicata killed herself, but before dying, she sent a letter to Tiberius, accusing Sejanus of poisoning Drusus 8 years earlier. She implicated Livilla, Drusus's widow, as Sejanus's accomplice and lover. Tiberius ordered Livilla sealed in a room and starved to death. Her mother Antonia was forced to carry out the sentence. Then the purges expanded. Anyone who had associated with Sejanus became suspect. Anyone who had benefited from his patronage, anyone who had prosecuted cases he supported, anyone who had spoken favorably of him, the delatores who had served him, were now accused themselves. The senators who had voted for his honors scrambled to condemn him. Some succeeded, some did not. Tacitus records that the executions continued for months. Whole families were destroyed. Children were killed because their parents had been convicted. Wives were prosecuted for failing to denounce their husbands. Old men were dragged from retirement and strangled for letters they had written decades earlier. And through all of this, Tiberius remained on Capri. This is the detail that changes everything. The emperor is not present. He does not witness the executions. He does not see the bodies. He does not hear the accusations read aloud, or the verdicts pronounced. He receives reports. He sends letters. He makes decisions in isolation, surrounded by astrologers and philosophers, and a shrinking circle of trusted advisors, who understand that trust is itself dangerous. Suetonius records that in his final years, Tiberius became obsessed with privacy. He built 12 villas across Capri, each one isolated, each one fortified. He moved between them unpredictably. He trusted no one with his schedule. He ate food prepared only by specific slaves who were themselves kept isolated. He slept with weapons nearby. The astrologer Thrasyllus became his closest companion. Thrasyllus had predicted Tiberius would become emperor decades earlier, when such a prediction seemed absurd. Now Thrasyllus read the stars daily, interpreting omens, warning of conspiracies, identifying threats. Some sources suggest Tiberius had other astrologers thrown from the cliffs of Capri when their predictions proved false. Thrasyllus survived by being correct, or by being too valuable to kill, or by understanding that his value lay in confirming what Tiberius already believed. In 37 CE, Tiberius fell ill. He was 77 years old. The illness progressed rapidly. He lost consciousness. The court assumed he was dead. Caligula, his designated heir, began accepting congratulations. The Praetorian Guard prepared for the transition. Then Tiberius woke up. What happened next is recorded by multiple sources, with slight variations. Macro, the Praetorian prefect, who had succeeded Sejanus, either smothered Tiberius with a pillow, or ordered him strangled, or simply withheld food and water until he died of weakness. The exact method is debated. The fact of murder is not. Tiberius's body was brought back to Rome. The Senate met. They debated whether to grant him divine honors. Some senators argued he had governed well in the early years. Others recounted the purges, the trials, the executions. Eventually they voted for a modest funeral, and no deification. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. No temple was built. No cult was established. Suetonius records that when news of his death reached the streets, crowds celebrated. People chanted Tiberius to the Tiber, the traditional cry demanding a condemned criminal's body be thrown in the river. They did not get their wish, but the hatred was real. This is the first pattern: an emperor who begins with competence and descends into systematic cruelty, mediated by distance. Tiberius did not personally strangle anyone. He did not attend trials. He did not watch executions. He wrote letters. He gave orders. The violence happened elsewhere, performed by others, but authorized by him. The structure made it possible. The emperor's word was law. The Senate ratified what he commanded. The Praetorian Guard executed the sentences. The delatores provided the accusations, and the legal system processed everything with meticulous documentation. We have records of these trials. We have transcripts of charges. We have lists of the condemned. The horror was bureaucratic. Tiberius died hated, but the system that enabled him remained intact. The Praetorian Guard remained. The Senate remained. The laws regarding maiestas remained. The precedent that an emperor could purge aristocrats on suspicion alone remained. And all of it was inherited by the next emperor, who was 24 years old and had lived his entire adolescence watching Tiberius rule from isolation, while bodies piled on the Gemonian stairs. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History knows him as Caligula. He was loved at first. This is documented extensively. When Caligula entered Rome after Tiberius's death, crowds lined the streets. They called him our baby, our star, our darling. They had watched him grow up. His father Germanicus had been the most popular general of his generation, beloved by the legions and the people. When Germanicus died in 19 CE, possibly poisoned, public mourning was unprecedented. His widow Agrippina and their children became symbols of what Rome should be: noble, virtuous, generous, everything Tiberius was not. Caligula was the only adult male heir to survive Tiberius's purges. His brothers had died, officially of illness, though rumors of poison persisted. His mother Agrippina had been exiled and starved to death. His sisters survived through silence and compliance. Caligula himself survived by being harmless, by showing no ambition, by entertaining Tiberius during the years on Capri, by being careful, and now he was emperor. The first 7 months are remembered as a golden age. Caligula recalled exiles. He ended treason trials. He burned the records of Tiberius's informers. He gave generous games. He granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the legions. He appeared in public constantly, mingling with crowds, accepting petitions, demonstrating accessibility. The Senate praised him. The people worshipped him. Then in October of 37 CE, he fell ill. The illness lasted weeks. Its exact nature is unknown. Some sources describe fever and delirium. Others mention seizures. Modern historians have speculated about epilepsy, encephalitis, even poisoning that failed to kill him. We cannot diagnose across 2,000 years, but we know that when he recovered, something had changed. What followed is among the most disputed periods in Roman history. Our primary sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, Cassius, were written decades after the events and are openly hostile to Caligula. They describe systematic madness, theatrical cruelty, sexual perversion, and claims to divinity. Some modern historians accept these accounts. Others argue they are senatorial propaganda, exaggerations designed to justify his assassination and legitimize his successors. But certain events are attested in multiple independent sources and supported by material evidence. We can verify these. We can know what happened, even if we cannot fully know why. In early 38 CE, Caligula ordered the execution of Tiberius Gemellus, his adopted son and co-heir. Gemellus was 17 or 18 years old. The official charge was conspiracy. No evidence was presented. No trial was held. Gemellus was forced to commit suicide. His tutor was executed shortly after for protesting. Then Macro, the Praetorian prefect, who had helped Caligula secure power, was ordered to commit suicide along with his wife Ennia. Macro had been indispensable 7 months earlier. Now he was dangerous. The same pattern Tiberius had used with Sejanus. Remove the kingmaker before he realizes he can make another king. These were political murders, ruthless but comprehensible within the logic of imperial survival. What came next was different. Caligula's beloved sister Drusilla died in June of 38 CE. The cause is unknown. Grief is documented. Caligula ordered national mourning. He had Drusilla deified, the first imperial woman to receive such honors. Temples were decreed, priesthoods established, oaths sworn in her name. This was extraordinary but not yet mad. But according to Suetonius and Dio, Caligula then claimed Drusilla had been his wife, not merely his sister. He instituted penalties for anyone who celebrated or laughed during the mourning period. He left Rome suddenly and wandered through Campania and Sicily for months, unkempt and irrational. When he returned, he was changed. This is where the accounts become extreme. Suetonius describes Caligula forcing senators to run beside his chariot for miles, setting up a brothel in the palace using senators' wives, feeding criminals to animals in the circus, not as execution, but as entertainment between races, building a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, 2 miles long just to ride across it, wearing armor taken from Alexander's tomb, purely to prove a court astrologer wrong, who had said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding across the bay. Some of this is verifiable. The bridge across Baiae is mentioned by 3 separate sources and described in enough detail that its construction is plausible. The cost would have been enormous, the purpose incomprehensible, except as display. Other elements are impossible to verify, but follow consistent patterns. Caligula's relationship with the Senate deteriorated completely. He humiliated them publicly, forced them to vote for absurd honors, made them watch as he elevated his horse Incitatus to consul, or at least threatened to. Whether Incitatus actually became consul is disputed. That Caligula entertained the idea to mock the Senate is not. The key detail is this: Caligula understood the performance of power. He had grown up watching Augustus's careful fiction. He had watched Tiberius pretend to consult while commanding absolutely. He had seen how the Senate voted unanimously for whatever the emperor wanted, while maintaining the illusion of deliberation, and he decided to expose the fiction by making it absurd. When Caligula declared himself a living god and ordered a temple built to himself, he was violating custom but not law. Emperors were deified after death. Caligula simply accelerated the process. When he appeared in public, dressed as Jupiter, or Neptune, or Venus, he was performing divinity, forcing Rome to acknowledge what it had already implicitly accepted. The emperor was beyond mortal limitation. But performance became cruelty in specific documented cases. In 39 CE, Caligula ordered Lentulus Gatulicus, the popular legate of Germania Superior, recalled and executed for conspiracy. Gatulicus had governed for 10 years with the loyalty of his legions. His execution nearly caused a mutiny. It was prevented only by Caligula traveling to the German frontier personally and executing the suspected conspirators himself. While in Germany and Gaul, Caligula prepared for an invasion of Britain. Legions were assembled, ships were built, supply lines were established. Then, according to multiple sources, Caligula ordered his soldiers to collect seashells on the beach as spoils of the sea, and declared victory over Neptune. He returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph. Modern historians debate this endlessly. Some think it's literal truth proving insanity. Others think it was a metaphor misunderstood by hostile sources. Still others suggest it was deliberate mockery of military triumph, forcing the Senate to celebrate an absurdity. What's certain is that legions were mobilized, money was spent, and no invasion occurred. Back in Rome, the executions resumed. Members of the aristocracy were killed on suspicion of conspiracy. Their property was confiscated. The treasury, empty from expenditures, was refilled through prosecutions. The delatores returned. The machinery Tiberius had built was reactivated. But Caligula added innovation. He attended the executions personally. Suetonius describes him ordering deaths during dinner and having them carried out immediately, so he could watch, making parents witness their children's executions, executing people slowly, with small wounds, so they would feel themselves dying, ordering the formula, strike so that he feels himself dying. These details come from hostile sources, but they are specific, they are repeated, and they align with what we know happened next. In 41 CFE, a conspiracy formed. The details are documented in multiple sources with remarkable consistency. The primary conspirators were Cassius Dio and Cornelius Sabinus, both tribunes of the Praetorian Guard. Dio had been mocked by Caligula repeatedly for having a high voice. He was made to use obscene watchwords when reporting for duty. He was called effeminate publicly. For months he endured this. Then he recruited allies. The plot was simple. During the Palatine Games in January, while Caligula was moving through an underground passage between the theatre and the palace, the conspirators would strike. They did not plan to overthrow the government. They planned to kill one man. On January 24th, 41 CE, Caligula attended the games. At midday he left for lunch. He walked through the cryptoporticus, the covered passage. Curia stepped forward and struck him with a sword. Caligula fell. The other conspirators surrounded him and continued stabbing. 30 wounds. He died there in the passage. The Praetorian Guard then went to the palace and killed Caligula's wife Suetonius and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla. Suetonius was stabbed. The baby's head was smashed against a wall. These murders were not part of the original conspiracy. They were improvised. The Praetorian Guard understood that as long as any heir existed, civil war was possible. Caligula's body was taken to the gardens of Lamia, partially cremated, hastily buried under a shallow layer of dirt. Later his sisters returned from exile, exhumed the remains, cremated them properly, and placed them in the mausoleum of Augustus. The Senate met and debated abolishing the Principate entirely. For one day, it seemed the Republic might return. Then the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace. They declared him emperor. The Senate, surrounded by armed soldiers, accepted. Caligula had ruled for 3 years, 10 months and 8 days. He was 28 years old when he died. His reign cost the treasury nearly 3 billion sesterces. How many people died in his purges is unknown. Suetonius suggests hundreds. Modern estimates are more conservative, but still substantial. What we know with certainty is this: a young emperor, who began with universal love, ended stabbed to death in a hallway, while his guards did nothing. The structure that should have restrained him, the Senate, the law, the traditions of the Republic did not. It could not, because the structure was a fiction, and Caligula had exposed it. The pattern continues. Tiberius withdrew and ruled through paranoia. Caligula performed and ruled through spectacle. Both discovered that absolute power means exactly that. Absolute, without restraint, without consequence, until the final consequence, which is death. The third emperor we examine is different. He did not begin cruel. He began intelligent, educated, artistic, a poet, a musician, a patron of the arts. He was 17 years old when he became emperor. His name was Nero. We must be careful here. More than any other emperor we discuss, Nero is buried under layers of propaganda, myth, and Christian martyrology. The sources are hostile. Suetonius and Tacitus despised him. Dio Cassius wrote a century after his death. The Christian tradition blamed him for the persecution of early believers and transformed him into the Antichrist. Renaissance and Enlightenment historians relied on these texts uncritically. Modern scholarship has worked to separate fact from fiction. The result is incomplete but revealing. Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. The fiddle did not exist yet, and he was in Antium when the fire started. He did not specifically target Christians. That persecution likely occurred, but was not central to his reign. He did not kill every member of his family. Some survived. Some were executed for legitimate conspiracies. Some died of unrelated causes. But what remains after we strip away mythology is still terrible. Nero became emperor in 54 CE when his stepfather Claudius died. The death was almost certainly poison. Agrippina, Nero's mother, had married Claudius, convinced him to adopt Nero, and then eliminated him once the succession was secure. This is the environment Nero inherited. Power came through murder. Security came through eliminating rivals. Trust was fatal. The first 5 years are called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. He was guided by Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. Together they managed the empire competently. Taxes were reduced, corruption was prosecuted, the Senate was consulted. Nero attended meetings, he gave speeches, he was interested in art and music, which the aristocracy found undignified but not dangerous. Then the murders began. In 55 CE, Britannicus died at dinner. Britannicus was Claudius's biological son, the legitimate heir Nero had displaced. He was 14 years old. The death was attributed to epilepsy. Every source agrees it was poison. The dinner was public. Britannicus drank, convulsed, and died while Nero watched. Tacitus records that Nero told the guests to remain calm. This had happened before. Britannicus would recover. He did not. The body was removed. Dinner continued. This was the first test. Nero had ordered the murder of a child at a dinner party in front of witnesses. Nothing happened. The Senate said nothing. The Praetorian Guard did nothing. Seneca and Burrus, if they disapproved, remained silent. The lesson was clear. The emperor could kill openly and face no consequence. But for 4 more years, things remained relatively stable. Then Nero's relationship with his mother collapsed. The details are disputed, but the basic pattern is documented. Agrippina had controlled Nero's early reign. She sat behind a curtain during Senate meetings. She approved appointments. She vetoed decisions. Nero, reaching adulthood, wanted independence. Agrippina refused to yield. In 59 CE, Nero decided to kill her. The first attempt was theatrical. He gave Agrippina a ship designed to collapse at sea. She boarded. The ship sailed from Baiae. At a prearranged signal, the ceiling of her cabin collapsed. The ship began to sink. Agrippina jumped into the water and swam to shore. She survived. The attempt was so obvious that Agrippina immediately understood what had happened. She sent a message to Nero, saying she had been in an accident but was unharmed. Nero panicked. He consulted with Seneca and Burrus. They told him to finish it. If Agrippina lived, she would retaliate. The only safety was her death. Nero sent assassins to her villa. They broke in at night. Agrippina was in her bedroom, with a single servant. When the assassins entered, she understood. According to Tacitus, she pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here." They beat her to death. The servant was killed as well. Nero then claimed Agrippina had been conspiring against him and had killed herself when the plot was discovered. The Senate, receiving this message, voted thanks to the gods for Nero's safety and ordered public celebrations. No one believed the story. Everyone accepted it, because the alternative was to accuse the emperor of matricide, and that was treason. This is the irreversible moment, not the murder itself, Roman emperors had killed family members before, but the public lie, and the public acceptance of that lie. The Senate thanked Nero for surviving a conspiracy that never existed, and praised him for escaping danger from a woman he had murdered. The fiction became official truth, and Nero understood that there was no limit. Over the next 9 years, Nero killed his wife Octavia by fabricating adultery charges and forcing her into exile, where she was executed. He kicked his pregnant second wife Poppaea to death in a rage, according to Tacitus, though some sources say she died in childbirth. He executed the general Corbulo, who had secured victories in Armenia, by inviting him to Greece and ordering him to commit suicide. Corbulo complied, saying only Axios, I am worthy of this. He executed Seneca in 65 CE, after the Pisonian conspiracy. The conspiracy was real. Dozens of senators and equestrians planned to assassinate Nero and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso. The plot was discovered. The purges were extensive. Senators were forced to commit suicide. Their estates were confiscated. The executions continued for months. Seneca was implicated, possibly falsely. Nero ordered him to die. Seneca cut his veins in a bath, while his wife Pompeia Paulina cut hers beside him. Nero ordered her saved. She survived. Seneca bled to death slowly, dictating philosophical observations to scribes while he died. But these were political murders, brutal but functional. What happened in 64 CE was different. On the night of July 18th, a fire started in the Circus Maximus. Rome was densely packed, built primarily of wood and brick, with narrow streets and no organized fire brigade. The fire spread rapidly. It burned for 6 days. When it finally stopped, 3 of Rome's 14 districts were completely destroyed. 7 more were heavily damaged. Hundreds died. Thousands were left homeless. Nero was in Antium when the fire started. He returned immediately and opened his gardens to refugees. He organized relief efforts. He imported grain. He set price controls on supplies. These facts are documented even by hostile sources. But rumors spread immediately that Nero had started the fire to clear land for his building projects. These rumors were almost certainly false. Nero gained nothing from the fire. It destroyed property tax revenue, destabilized the city, and created political crisis. But the rumors persisted, and Nero needed a scapegoat. According to Tacitus, Nero blamed the Christians. This is the earliest Roman mention of Christians as a distinct group. Tacitus describes them as a superstition, a sect hated for their abominations. Nero had them arrested. He had them killed in public spectacles. Some were crucified. Some were burned alive, used as torches to light his gardens at night. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. The scale of this persecution is debated. Tacitus suggests it was significant enough that even Romans who hated Christians began to feel pity. Other sources don't mention it at all. Christian tradition naturally emphasizes it and claims Peter and Paul were martyred during this period. Modern historians suggest the persecution was real, but localized, part of Nero's attempt to divert blame for the fire. What's certain is that Nero used the fire as an opportunity. He rebuilt the destroyed areas according to new codes, wider streets, height limits on buildings, mandatory use of stone. He began construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous palace complex that would eventually cover over 100 acres in central Rome. It included an artificial lake, gardens, pavilions covered in gold leaf, a rotating dining room, and a colossal bronze statue of Nero as the sun god, 120 feet tall. The cost was staggering. The treasury emptied rapidly. Nero responded by confiscating estates. The charge was always conspiracy or treason. The evidence was always testimony extracted under torture, or provided by delatores eager for their percentage. The Senate voted for each confiscation. The property reverted to the emperor. The pattern Tiberius had established, and Caligula had intensified, now became systematic revenue generation. In 65 CE, the Pisonian conspiracy gave Nero the excuse for extensive purges. 19 executions are named in Tacitus, including Seneca, the poet Lucan, and the general Corbulo. Forced suicides were ordered for dozens more. The playwright and novelist Petronius, possibly the author of the Satyricon, was ordered to die. He cut his veins, but did it slowly, spending his last hours at a dinner party, composing a satirical poem mocking Nero's sexual habits. He sent the poem to Nero before bleeding out completely. By 68 CE, Nero had spent 13 years stripping away every restraint. He had murdered his mother, his wives, his advisors, and countless senators. He had confiscated estates systematically. He had performed as an actor and chariot racer in public games, violating every aristocratic norm. He had declared himself a god and ordered temples built in his honor. He had built a palace that transformed the center of Rome into his personal pleasure complex. And then the legions revolted. It started in Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, declared rebellion. His motivation remains unclear. Some sources say he was appalled by Nero's behavior. Others suggest he resented taxation. Still others think he was maneuvering for personal power. What's clear is that he wrote to other governors, seeking support. One of them, Galba in Hispania Tarraconensis, accepted. Vindex's forces were defeated by the Rhine legions. Vindex killed himself, but Galba declared himself emperor. Other governors followed. The Praetorian Guard, unpaid and alienated, turned against Nero. The Senate declared him a public enemy. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor was deposed not by assassination or natural death, but by institutional rejection. Nero fled Rome. He went to a villa owned by his freedman Phaon. There, in the early morning of June 9th, 68 CE, he heard soldiers approaching. He ordered his secretary Epaphroditos to help him die. Epaphroditos cut Nero's throat. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. He had ruled for 13 years. His body was cremated by his old nurses and his mistress Acte. The ashes were placed in the family tomb of the Domitii on the Pincian Hill, not in the mausoleum of Augustus. The Senate ordered his images destroyed, his name erased from monuments, his Domus Aurea dismantled. But the Domus Aurea was too large to dismantle completely. Later emperors filled in the lower levels and built on top. The Colosseum was constructed on the site of Nero's artificial lake. His colossal statue was moved and reworked into a statue of the sun god. The palace itself was buried. It would not be rediscovered until the 15th century, when Renaissance artists lowered themselves on ropes into the buried rooms to study the frescoes by torchlight. They called them grotesques because they were found in grotto-like spaces. The word entered European languages to mean bizarre, distorted, fantastic. This is appropriate. Nero's reign was grotesque, not because he was mad. His actions follow rational patterns of power consolidation and threat elimination. Grotesque because the structure of absolute power distorted normal human behavior into monstrosity. The pattern deepens. Tiberius ruled through isolation and paranoia. Caligula ruled through performance and mockery. Nero ruled through aesthetics and spectacle, turning cruelty into art, turning murder into theater, turning the city itself into his stage. All three discovered that the Senate could not stop them, the law could not bind them, and the only limit to imperial power was death. After Nero's suicide, the empire convulsed. In 18 months, 4 men claimed the title of emperor. Galba was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. Otho defeated Galba's killers, and then killed himself when defeated by Vitellius. Vitellius was dragged through Rome and murdered when Vespasian's forces took the city. This is the year of the 4 emperors. 68-69 CE. Vespasian restored stability. He was a military man, practical, without aristocratic pretensions. He rebuilt the treasury through taxation, rather than confiscation. He began construction of the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum, on the site of Nero's lake. He ruled for 10 years and died of illness. His son Titus succeeded him peacefully. Titus ruled for 2 years and also died of illness. Then Titus's brother Domitian became emperor, and the pattern returned. Domitian is the fourth emperor we examine. He was 30 years old when he took power in 81 CE. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of his brother and father. During the year of the four emperors, when he was 18, he had been trapped in Rome during the final battle. He had hidden in the temple of Jupiter while the city burned around him. He had escaped disguised as a devotee of Isis. He had survived. Now he was emperor, and he remembered every slight, every humiliation, every moment of powerlessness. The first years were competent. Domitian completed the Colosseum. He strengthened the frontiers in Britain and Germany. He improved the pay and conditions for the army. He enforced public morality strictly, prosecuting adultery, banning castration, limiting theatrical performances. The aristocracy found him prudish and autocratic, but effective. Then the military campaigns began to fail. In 85 CE, the Dacians crossed the Danube and killed the governor of Moesia. Domitian led a campaign personally. The results were inconclusive. He declared victory and celebrated a triumph. In 86 CE, the Dacians invaded again. Domitian sent another force. It was destroyed. The general and thousands of soldiers died. Domitian sent yet another army. This one achieved a stalemate. Domitian negotiated peace and again celebrated a triumph. The Senate knew these triumphs were false. The aristocracy knew. The soldiers knew. But no one spoke openly, because by then Domitian had reactivated the treason laws. Maiestas prosecutions resumed in the late 80s. The pattern was familiar: an accusation, a trial, a conviction, confiscation of property, execution or forced suicide. The delator is returned. The treasury, strained by military spending, was refilled through confiscation. The cycle fed itself, but Domitian added refinements. He attended trials personally. He questioned witnesses himself. He cross-examined the accused. He made the process intimate. And he expanded the definition of maiestas to include not just conspiracy, but also disrespect. A joke could be treason, a facial expression, failing to celebrate an imperial triumph with sufficient enthusiasm. Pliny the Younger, who lived through Domitian's reign, describes the atmosphere in the Senate. Silence was safest, but silence could be interpreted as disapproval. So senators learned to speak the required words, with the required tone at the required moments. They learned to watch each other for deviations. They learned to denounce each other preemptively. The Senate became a theater of performed loyalty, where every gesture was scrutinized. In 89 CE, Lucius Antonius Saturninus, governor of Germania Superior, revolted. He declared himself emperor and secured support from 2 legions. The revolt was crushed within weeks by the governor of Germania Inferior. Saturninus was killed. His letters were burned unread. His supporters were executed. Domitian traveled to Germany personally to investigate. After Saturninus's revolt, the purges intensified. Domitian began seeing conspiracies everywhere. He trusted no one. He employed a network of informers and secret police. The delatores operated openly now, wealthy and powerful. Some were themselves eventually accused and executed. Trust became impossible. Suetonius records that Domitian lined the portico where he took afternoon walks with polished moonstone, so he could see reflections behind him. He gave audiences alone, without guards or witnesses. He interviewed suspected conspirators personally, often late at night. He kept detailed files on senators, noting their associations, their habits, their slaves, their wives. The executions became more theatrical. Domitian did not just kill, he destroyed. When Aelius Lamia, a former consul, made a joke about the emperor's wife, Domitian had him strangled. When Salvius Cocceianus studied the biography of Otho, suggesting interest in alternative emperors, Domitian forced him to commit suicide. When Juventius Celsus, a friend of Domitian's youth, was suspected of disloyalty, Domitian had him tortured personally to extract a confession before execution. Suetonius claims Domitian once showed a senator the list of people he planned to execute, and the senator's name was on it. The senator, horrified, begged for mercy. Domitian laughed and said he had not yet decided. The senator left. Days later he was arrested and executed. Whether this specific incident occurred is uncertain. That it is plausible tells us what Domitian's reign had become. In 95 CE, Domitian executed Flavius Clemens, his cousin and consul, on charges of atheism. Clemens's wife Domitilla was exiled. Their children had been designated as Domitian's heirs. Now they were disinherited. The charge of atheism likely meant Christianity or Judaism, refusal to participate in imperial cult worship. This is one of the few documented persecutions of Christians in the 1st century. It was not systematic, it was personal. Clemens had been disloyal. His religion provided the excuse. By 96 CE, Domitian had ruled for 15 years. The treasury was full from confiscations. The frontiers were stable through diplomacy rather than victory. The aristocracy hated him completely. The Senate met in terror, and a conspiracy formed. The conspirators included Stephanus, a freedman of Domitian's niece Domitilla, Parthenius, the chamberlain, presumably members of the Praetorian Guard, though their involvement is unclear. The motivation was survival. All of them were on Domitian's lists. All of them would eventually be executed if they did nothing. On September 18, 96 CE, Stephanus approached Domitian claiming to have discovered a conspiracy. He had his arm in a sling, wrapped in bandages. For days before, when he met with Domitian privately, he handed him a written list of conspirators. As Domitian read, Stephanus pulled a dagger from the bandages and stabbed him. Domitian fought. He was 44 years old and strong. He grabbed at the blade, cutting his fingers. He called for help. A child who slept in his room with a knife under the pillow for protection ran to get it. The sheath was there, but the blade had been removed. The doors were locked from outside. More conspirators entered. They stabbed Domitian repeatedly. 7 wounds. He died on the floor of his bedroom. The Senate met that same day. They voted Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory. His name was erased from monuments. His images were destroyed. His arches were demolished. His coins were melted down. Every law he had passed was nullified. Every appointment was reviewed. Within days it became illegal to speak his name. The Praetorian Guard demanded his deification. The Senate refused. It was the first time the Senate had successfully opposed the Guard. They named Nerva, a 60-year-old senator with no children and no political base, as emperor. Nerva would rule for 2 years before adopting Trajan as heir. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty would bring stability and prosperity. Historians would call it the height of the empire. But none of that erases what happened. 15 years of systematic terror, executions based on suspicion, trials that were theater, a Senate reduced to performing loyalty while colleagues disappeared, an emperor so paranoid he lined his walls with reflective stone to see assassins approaching, and an assassination that was both inevitable and necessary. The pattern is now complete in 4 variations: Tiberius's withdrawal, Caligula's performance, Nero's aestheticization, Domitian's paranoia. Each one discovered that absolute power corrupts absolutely, not as metaphor, but as documented historical fact. Each one found that the structure of the Principate enabled systematic cruelty because it concentrated all power in one person and provided no institutional check on that person's decisions. But we have one more emperor to examine, and he is different. The others were at least Roman. They were born into the system. They understood its traditions, even as they violated them. The 5th emperor came from outside. He was 14 years old when he arrived in Rome. He was a priest of a foreign god. He did not care about Roman tradition, because he did not understand it. His name was Elagabalus. We return to the beginning. The body in the lead coffin, the smell in the Senate chamber, the murder ordered by his grandmother, carried out by the Praetorian Guard, and celebrated by Rome. To understand how this happened, we must go back 5 years. In 217 CE, The Emperor Caracalla was assassinated while urinating on the side of a road in Mesopotamia. The assassin was a Praetorian Guard with a personal grudge. The conspiracy was organized by Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, who immediately declared himself emperor. This was unprecedented. Macrinus was not a senator, he was an equestrian. He had never held military command, but he controlled the guard, and he was with the army in Mesopotamia. The Senate in Rome accepted, but Caracalla's aunt Julia Maesa did not accept. She was the sister of Julia Domna, Caracalla's mother. She was wealthy, intelligent, and ruthless. She had two daughters, Julia Soamemias and Julia Mamaea. Each daughter had a son. Both boys were in Syria, where the family had estates and connections, and both boys, as descendants of the Severan dynasty through the female line, had better claims to the throne than Macrinus. The older boy was named Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was 14 years old, and he was the hereditary high priest of Elagabalus, the sun god of Emesa. Julia Maesa began a conspiracy. She had money. She had connections to the Syrian legions, many of whom had served under her brother-in-law Septimius Severus. And she had a story. The boy was not just Caracalla's cousin. He was Caracalla's illegitimate son. This was almost certainly false, but it was useful. In May of 218 CE, the Third Gallic Legion declared Varius Avitus emperor. Other Syrian legions followed. Macrinus marched to meet them. The forces met at Antioch. Macrinus's troops saw a 14-year-old boy dressed in purple robes embroidered with gold, claiming to be the son of Caracalla, and they switched sides. Macrinus fled. He was captured and executed. His head was sent to Rome. Varius Avitus took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, linking himself to the respected Antonine emperors, but Rome would know him by his priestly title, Elagabalus. He arrived in Rome in 219 CE, and he brought his god with him. The god Elagabalus was represented by a black conical stone, possibly a meteorite. Elagabalus had the stone transported to Rome in a chariot pulled by white horses. No human was allowed to touch the reins. The emperor walked backward before it the entire way, watching the stone, never turning his back. When the stone reached Rome, Elagabalus built a temple for it on the Palatine Hill. He called it the Elagabalium. This was shocking. Rome had absorbed foreign gods before, but they were given temples outside the sacred boundary or incorporated into existing cults. Elagabalus placed his god at the center of Roman religion. He declared Elagabalus supreme over Jupiter. He removed sacred objects from other temples, including the Palladium, the statue that supposedly protected Rome, and placed them in the Elagabalium. He made himself high priest and conducted Syrian rituals publicly. The rituals were disturbing to Roman sensibilities. They involved music, dancing, processions. They included animal sacrifice conducted in the Syrian manner, not the Roman. They were ecstatic, emotional, loud. This violated Roman religious practice, which was supposed to be solemn, formal, quiet, and Elagabalus conducted these rituals wearing Syrian priestly robes, makeup, jewelry, and a crown. The sources, all written decades later by hostile Roman aristocrats, describe Elagabalus as effeminate, sexually debauched, and insane. These descriptions must be read critically. Roman writers used accusations of sexual deviance and Eastern decadence as standard ways to delegitimize emperors they hated. Similar language had been used about Caligula and Nero, but certain facts are documented across multiple sources and supported by material evidence. Elagabalus married 5 times in 4 years. One wife was a Vestal virgin, which was sacrilege. Vestals took vows of chastity and were supposed to serve for 30 years. He divorced her within a year. He married a woman named Aquilia Severa, divorced her, married someone else, then married Aquilia again. According to Dio Cassius, writing decades later, Elagabalus appeared in public in women's clothing. He wore wigs. He used makeup. He took a chariot driver named Hierocles as a lover and referred to Hierocles as his husband. Whether this indicates gender identity or sexual behavior, or simply performance, is impossible to determine across 2 millennia. What's clear is that it violated Roman norms completely, but the sexual behavior, real or exaggerated, was not why Elagabalus was killed. Romans could tolerate sexual scandal. They had tolerated it in other emperors. What they could not tolerate was the disrespect to Roman religion, and the promotion of a foreign god above Jupiter. By 221 CE, Julia Maesa understood that Elagabalus had to be removed. He was destroying the dynasty she had fought to restore. The Senate hated him. The Praetorian Guard resented him. The people mocked him, and he showed no sign of changing. Maesa arranged for Elagabalus to adopt her other grandson, Julia Mamea's son, also named Alexander. Alexander was 13 years old. He was given the title Caesar, designating him as heir. This should have secured the succession. Instead, it created competition. Elagabalus began to see Alexander as a threat. He tried to have Alexander's name removed from documents. He spread rumors about Alexander's legitimacy. He may have planned to have Alexander killed, though the sources are unclear. Julia Mamea responded by protecting Alexander with guards loyal to her. The palace split into factions. On March 11, 222 CE, the crisis came to a head. The Praetorian Guard mutinied. They declared they would no longer obey Elagabalus. They demanded Alexander be made co-emperor. Elagabalus, terrified, went to the Praetorian camp with Alexander, trying to appease them. It did not work. The guard attacked. Elagabalus tried to flee. He hid in a latrine in the palace. The guards found him and dragged him out. They killed him. They killed his mother Julia Soamemius, who tried to protect him. They mutilated both bodies. Then they dragged the corpses through Rome, threw them in the Tiber, and tried to weigh them down with stones, so they would not float. The Senate met. They ordered Damnatio Memoriae. His name was erased. His images were destroyed. His religious reforms were reversed. The black stone was sent back to Emesa. The Elagabalium was demolished. Within weeks it was as if he had never existed. But the body had already arrived in pieces. 14 days earlier, the Senate had already smelled what power becomes when it decays. They had already seen that an emperor could be 18 years old and dead, killed by the same institution that had made him, discarded by the same family that had elevated him. Elagabalus ruled for 4 years. He was the shortest-lived emperor we have examined. His cruelty, compared to the others, was minor. He did not conduct systematic purges. He did not execute senators en masse. He did not torture people for entertainment. His crime was cultural, religious. He threatened Roman identity by elevating a foreign god and performing foreign rituals at the center of Roman power. But his inclusion in this list is deliberate, because his story reveals something the others obscure. The empire did not just enable cruel emperors, it enabled incompetent ones, child emperors, foreign emperors, emperors who had no understanding of Roman tradition, no military experience, no administrative skill. The structure of the Principate meant that once someone held power, nothing could remove them except death. The Praetorian Guard made and unmade emperors. Between Augustus and Constantine, they killed 13. They auctioned the throne to the highest bidder in 193 CE. After murdering Pertinax, the buyer Didius Julian Ace ruled for 66 days before being killed by soldiers loyal to Septimius Severus, who then ruled for 18 years and founded the Severan dynasty that produced Caracalla, Elagabalus, and Alexander Severus. This is the context. The Severan dynasty was built on military coup. It was maintained by paying the army enormous bonuses. It was legitimized through propaganda and divine honors. And when it failed to deliver those bonuses, or maintain military loyalty, it collapsed into assassination. Elagabalus was murdered not because he was cruel but because he was useless. He did not understand how to maintain the fiction of Roman tradition while exercising absolute power. He simply exercised power and ignored tradition, and the structure which had tolerated systematic torture and mass execution under previous emperors could not tolerate that. This is the final pattern. The cruelest thing about the Roman Empire was not individual emperors, it was the system that made such emperors inevitable, a structure that concentrated unlimited power in one person, that provided no institutional check on that person's decisions, that made the Senate a theater for performing loyalty, that made the Praetorian Guard both kingmakers and executioners, that made law whatever the emperor said it was, that made the gods subject to imperial interpretation. The system survived because it worked. The empire was governed, taxes were collected, the frontiers were defended, the grain supply fed Rome, the aqueducts brought water, the roads connected provinces. The law, however corrupted at the top, still functioned for millions of people who never met an emperor, but at the center was a void, a single human being with absolute power and no restraint except death, and into that void, across 300 years, walked Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Elagabalus, and dozens of others. Some ruled well, some ruled poorly, some ruled with systematic cruelty that killed thousands, and the structure enabled all of it. We must ask why. Why did the Senate not revolt? Why did the aristocracy tolerate decades of purges, confiscations, humiliations? Why did the system persist? The answer is that the alternative was civil war. Every time an emperor died without a clear successor, the empire fractured. The year of the four emperors in 68-69 CE cost tens of thousands of lives. The civil wars after Commodomus's death in 193 CE devastated provinces and emptied the treasury. The crisis of the 3rd century, beginning in 235 CE, would produce 50 claimants to the throne in 50 years, and nearly destroy the empire entirely. The Principate, for all its horrors, provided stability. It provided a framework for succession, however violent. It provided a clear chain of command. It provided legitimacy, recognized across the Mediterranean world. And so the Senate accepted Tiberius's purges, because the alternative was chaos. They accepted Caligula's mockery, because deposing him might trigger civil war. They accepted Nero's confiscations, because the treasury needed funding. They accepted Domitian's paranoia, because the frontiers needed defense. They accepted Elagabalus's incompetence, until it threatened the dynasty itself. This is the logic of empire. Individual suffering is acceptable, if the system continues. Individual cruelty is tolerable, if the alternative is systemic collapse. The emperor can kill senators, confiscate estates, violate every norm, as long as he maintains the legions, pays the guard, and keeps the provinces stable. And when he cannot do those things, he dies, quickly, violently, and is replaced by someone who can. The 5 emperors we have examined were not aberrations. They were products of a system designed to concentrate power and eliminate alternatives. Tiberius did not invent the maiestas laws. He inherited them from Augustus and applied them systematically. Caligula did not invent the Praetorian Guard. He inherited them and learned they could kill emperors as easily as protect them. Nero did not invent confiscation as revenue. He inherited a treasury, emptied by Claudius, and refilled it through executions. Domitian did not invent paranoia. He inherited an empire where every emperor faced constant conspiracy and responded with preemptive violence. Elagabalus did not invent incompetence. He inherited a throne at 14 because his grandmother needed a puppet and discovered too late that puppets can be discarded. Each one made choices. Each one was responsible for individual acts of cruelty, but the structure made those choices possible, and those acts legal, and those cruelties systematic. This is what we inherit when we study Rome, not just the law, the architecture, the engineering, the literature, but also the knowledge that systems of absolute power produce predictable horrors, that concentrating power in one person, without meaningful restraint, does not produce wise philosopher kings. It produces Tiberius withdrawing to Capri, while bodies pile on stairs. It produces Caligula declaring himself a god, and forcing the Senate to vote divine honors. It produces Nero kicking his pregnant wife to death, and singing poetry while she dies. It produces Domitian lining his halls with reflective stone to see assassins coming. It produces Elagabalus, dying in a latrine at 18, murdered by the same guards who elevated him. The Senate chamber where Elagabalus's body arrived smelled for weeks because stone is porous. Marble absorbs. The smell of decay entered the rock and stayed there, even after the surface was cleaned, even after incense was burned, even after the Senate voted to erase his memory and nullify his existence. You cannot erase smell from stone. You cannot vote away what has been absorbed. The Senate sat in that chamber for years afterward. They breathed that air. They voted on appointments and ratified decrees and performed loyalty to the next emperor and the next and the next, and the smell remained. This is the legacy, not the triumphs or the monuments or the laws that survived into modernity, but the smell of decay in the Senate chamber, the knowledge that absolute power corrupts absolutely, the understanding that systems designed to prevent tyranny can be dismantled by precedent, by emergency, by the slow accumulation of unchecked authority. We remember these 5 emperors, not because they were uniquely evil. We remember them because they were uniquely enabled. The Roman Empire gave them the tools of systematic cruelty, and then acted surprised when they used them. The Senate gave them unlimited authority, and then wondered why they exercised it without restraint. The Praetorian Guard gave them military backing, and then assassinated them when they became inconvenient. The legal system gave them the force of law for every whim, and then documented every horror in meticulous detail, so we can read the transcripts 2,000 years later. This is what cruelty looks like when it becomes institutional, when it is legal, when it is documented, when it is voted on and ratified and celebrated with public games, when it happens not in secret, but in public spaces, on stairs where crowds gather, in arenas where children play, in Senate chambers where the smell lingers in the stone. The body arrived in pieces, not from violence, from decay. 14 days in a sealed lead coffin, under the Syrian sun. When they opened the container, what emerged was no longer recognizable as human, but it had been human, 18 years old, a high priest, an emperor, someone's son, someone's grandson, murdered by family, mutilated by guards, erased by Senate vote, remembered only as a cautionary tale about foreign gods and Syrian ritual, and the dangers of elevating children to absolute power. His name was Elagabalus. The Senate ordered that name destroyed, but we still say it, because we need to remember. We need to know what systems of power do to human bodies when no law can stop them. We need to understand that marble absorbs, that decay has a smell, that some stains cannot be voted away. The Roman Empire lasted another 200 years after Elagabalus. It would produce good emperors and bad emperors, and mediocre emperors. It would face invasions and plagues, an economic collapse. It would split into East and West. It would convert to Christianity and redefine itself entirely. But the structure of absolute imperial power would remain until the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476 CE. And even then, the idea persisted. Byzantine emperors, Carolingian emperors, Holy Roman emperors, Russian czars, every attempt to recreate Rome's glory also recreated its structure, and every recreation of that structure eventually produced its own Tiberius, its own Caligula, its own Nero, its own Domitian, its own Elagabalus, because the cruelty was never personal, it was systemic, it was structural, it was the inevitable result of placing unlimited power in human hands and removing all meaningful restraint. We study these 5 emperors, not to judge them across 2 millennia, not to pretend we would have done better, but to understand what they reveal about power itself, how it concentrates, how it corrupts, how it transforms ordinary human vice into systematic horror, how it makes murder legal, and torture policy, and erasure an official act of the state. The Senate voted, the Praetorian Guard executed, the delatores accused, the judges convicted, the executioners strangled, the bodies were thrown downstairs, and Rome continued. The aqueducts still brought water, the grain ships still arrived from Egypt, The legions still defended the frontiers. The empire still functioned. This is the horror, not that it happened, but that it happened within a functioning system, that people went to work and raised families, and attended games and worshipped gods, while senators were strangled in prison, and bodies rotted on public stairs, and emperors kicked pregnant wives to death. The cruelty was not exceptional, it was ordinary. It was built into the daily operation of imperial power. It was documented in official records. It was voted on by the Senate. It was carried out by guards who received regular salaries and retirement benefits. It was legal. This is what we must remember, not the names of the 5 emperors, though we should remember those too, but the structure that made them possible, the system that enabled them, the precedents that normalized their cruelty, the institutions that carried out their orders, the bureaucracy that documented their crimes, the Senate that voted for their decrees, the people who accepted it all because the alternative seemed worse. The body arrived in pieces. The Senate chamber smelled for weeks. The smell entered the marble and stayed there. You cannot vote away what stone has absorbed. We live in a world built on Rome's ruins. Our law derives from Roman law. Our architecture echoes Roman buildings. Our literature is shaped by Latin. Our political vocabulary comes from the Senate and the Forum. We inherit the good with the bad, the engineering with the crucifixions, the law with the purges, the glory with the decay. And we must ask ourselves, what are we building now? What systems are we creating? What power are we concentrating? What restraints are we removing? What precedents are we setting? What will future historians say about us when they examine our ruins and read our records and try to understand how ordinary people participated in extraordinary horror? The Roman Empire teaches us that civilization and cruelty are not opposites. They can coexist. They can reinforce each other. The same system that builds aqueducts can build crosses. The same law that protects property can confiscate estates. The same Senate that votes on grain distribution can vote for execution. The same guards that protect the emperor can murder him. This is the lesson. Not that Rome was cruel, but that civilization does not prevent cruelty, that progress does not eliminate horror, that systems of power, however sophisticated, can be used for systematic evil, and that the distance between competent governance and systematic torture is shorter than we want to believe. The 5 emperors are dead, their bones are dust, their monuments are ruins, their names were erased and then recovered by historians. But the structure they inhabited persists in different forms. Every concentration of power, every removal of restraint, every precedent that normalizes the abnormal, every vote that makes cruelty legal, every document that records horror in bureaucratic language. We remember Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, and Elagabalus, not because they were monsters. We remember them because they were human, and the most terrifying thing about human beings is what we become when given absolute power and no meaningful restraint. The smell stays in the marble, the stain remains, the record endures, and we are left with the knowledge that empire and atrocity are not incompatible. They are in fact often inseparable. This is what the Romans built. This is what they left us. Not just the Colosseum and the Pantheon and the law codes, but the knowledge of what happens when civilization constructs systems of absolute power, and then acts surprised when those systems produce absolute corruption. The body arrived in pieces. 14 days of decay. The Senate opened the container. The smell entered the marble, and stone remembers.